Welcome back to Incident Response Forum Europe 2020. The next session we have is the EU incident response in the era of COVID-19 and work from home. We've got a terrific panel coming up, and let's get right to it. Let's get started. To moderate the discussion, we have Tony Kim, who is the global co-chair of Orrick's Cyber Privacy and Data Innovation Practice, which is perhaps the largest cyber practice in the world at any law firm. And what I love about Tony is a lot of us have sort of splintered off into, be it energy, retail, healthcare, financial, whatever, into areas of real expertise within cyber and incident response. But Tony is one of those people who can really cover the entire regulatory paradigm. And he brings a very unique perspective today in particular. Firstly, he serves on Orrick's executive committee, which, like all law firms, must get in front of their own cybersecurity challenges. And it's nice to see some of us cyber people rising the ranks of the law firm chain. And second, Tony can come in before a breach and uses the lessons learned in IR with preparedness. And I've seen this firsthand because I have the pleasure of working him on an engagement right now where he's helping a company prepare for the inevitable breach, which is a lot of fun to watch and alert, and like I said, learn from. Tony's in Washington, D.C., so welcome, Tony. And next up, we have Gail Crawford of Latham and Watkins, and she is the global chair, another chair, of Latham's Data and Technology Transaction Practice. She helps clients navigate complex data privacy and security matters. I took some time and I watched some of Gail's videos and Latham's videos on the subject of cyber and the GDPR. And what I admired most about Gail's approach is that she seems to thrive when there's a lot of gray area, where the situation is one of first impression. And it really takes a courageous lawyer to tackle those kinds of problems. I think most of the people listening are lawyers like that today. And I think Gail's really sort of the epitome of this, because most of the stuff that these panelists in particular do is often one of first impression. So Gail's in London. So great to have you here, Gail. Welcome. Next up is Eva Pulliam from Arent, and she is a cyber specialist who provides brand protection, legal guidance in the area of data privacy, advertising and marketing, and trademark. I actually started out my career in the late 80s at Arent, and it's a marvelous firm with a genuine culture of innovation. And I like the value proposition there because it's not just providing legal advice, but also making their clients more successful. And I saw that in some of Eva's materials on the website, and I realized that she was kind of the perfect example of this approach, sort of real-time practical advice. She recently co-authored an article that I read called The Global Evolution of Data Protection Law. Are you meeting your obligations? And again, typical of people like Eva to get in front of very, very murky areas. Eva's in Northern Virginia in the US right now. Welcome, Eva. Excellent. Next up is Ryan Rubin of Ankura Consulting Group. He is a senior managing director at Ankura, and he is based in London. He's had over 23 years of global Big Four and boutique experience to help clients holistically manage complex cyber and tech challenges from the boardroom to the network. And holistic means what it says, in the sense when you go into a data security incident, you shouldn't assume it's an attacker. It might be someone from the inside. It might be a disgruntled employee. It might be, as they say in London, the bad leaver, someone who leaves badly. And I love that about Ryan's approach. I love his global experience spanning insurance, retail, investment banking, private equity, construction, pharma, oil and gas, media, retirement, airlines. The list goes on and on and on. So no matter what kind of breach, again, Ryan is the right person for the job. I look at Ryan as sort of being the expert's expert, and he's coming to us from London, and I want to welcome Ryan and this terrific panel.
Thank you very much. Hi.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to you, Tony, and I'm going to move over to the breakout room, get the next group ready.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting us to the forum. This is always one of our favorite events every year. And John and Bruce, you do a fantastic job putting it on. So again, thank you very much. Just for the audience, when Bruce and John asked us to do a session at the IR forum titled EU Incident Response in the Era of COVID-19 and Work from Home, we thought, okay, that's interesting. Let's sort of Google it, Bing it. And, you know, there's a ton of hits, right? We're like, wow, a ton of hits. But then as you realize you're scrolling down, it's simply Bruce and John's relentless advertising, because the only time that this phrase or concept as a whole comes up is in repeated SEO marketing for this panel at this forum. So that's a segue into saying, thank goodness we have an unbelievable panel here to educate us on this thought-leading issue. So a little bit of table setting before we get into it. I love, as an outside counsel, surveying clients, and I do it almost always before speaking events because I want to get a perspective, especially in this sort of virtual age, when we can't poll the audience. But please do chat and give us your thoughts and questions. But I asked 4 general counsel of multinationals, shall remain nameless, what, if anything, has changed in terms of your cybersecurity posture due to COVID-19 and or work from home? So not CIOs or CISOs or CPOs, but I asked GCs, 4 of them. And here are the responses. 1, not much. 2, I think we've raised our exposure by constantly being on Zoom or WebEx or Teams. 3, nothing material. And 4, my favorite, I shudder to think about what's going on in people's homes. So with that, Ryan, what's going on in people? No, I'm just kidding. Don't answer that question. Ryan, give us a sense from where you sit, the impact, if any, again, for some table setting, that COVID and or work from home has had just on the cybersecurity landscape. And we, of course, had a panel right before this covering some of these topics, but I want to just level set on this panel before we get into it, if you don't mind.
Great. Thank you very much, Tony. So one of the things that strikes me very much is that COVID-19 and remote access working has effectively accelerated the rate of change as it comes to digital transformation in organizations. A lot of people were thinking about moving into the cloud, looking to adopt platforms like Office 365 or Google Suite. And for some, this was something that was going to happen in the next 6 months, the next 12 months. And all of a sudden, this COVID-19 thing hit, and everybody had to go to work from home, have access to systems and data, and it did catch quite a few people by surprise. So for those organizations that had to rapidly buy the services, scramble together to get servers up and running, get people trained up, it was actually quite a big jump and quite a big leap of faith. For those that were already along this journey, it actually was quite seamless. And I know some of the companies I've been working with and working for have already had a number of the systems in play in order to deal with this. But when it comes to those in the security world, we do need to rethink a lot of the strategy around security because, again, as you mentioned, people are working from connecting in to the corporate environment from their homes, maybe using home devices. The Wi-Fi is not only being shared by the employee, but also by the kids playing Xbox and kids that are doing homeschooling. And all of these things now become part of this security risk posture that maybe wasn't factored into the original risk assessment that was done 12 months ago or 18 months ago when the company was thinking about managing their security. So some dramatic change, and I'm happy to talk a bit more, but I can hand back to you, and if there are any other questions, we can dip into it in a bit more detail.
So fantastic. Eva, just turning to you, I think building off of what Ryan was just talking about in terms of the sort of acceleration of cloud service and these mobility tools, et cetera. So just as a practitioner, as outside counsel, we've sort of seen in the news, right? There's some, is there more COVID-related attacks, COVID-themed attacks, et cetera? Can you just give us a little insight into that dynamic and maybe building off of what Ryan just said?
Yeah, of course. Based on stats, we're seeing perhaps a 70% increase in ransomware with COVID-19. There's just so many people online, as Ryan was saying, they're working from home, they're going to school from home, and they're doing all kinds of things from home. So now instead of crime being in the streets, crime is kind of coming into your home through your devices. There's a lot of phishing, there's a lot of spear phishing, social engineering, and things like that are coming in, and that's attacking the workplaces. Employees definitely need training to help, combat those types of attacks on the network. There's an uptick in browser-based infections, and there's just really a lot of infections kind of coming into our computer systems that perhaps we weren't as used to or didn't have to deal with such volume previously. So the volume has definitely increased from a mobile and computer standpoint. It's really just a lot of it. It's a top concern. The payments are getting bigger and bigger. Everyone needs their networks to be up and running right now. So hitting someone with a ransomware, particularly if they don't have a good backup system, it could really take them out. In target industries, that are relevant to COVID, that's also a really special place for hackers to hit, because they know that payment may be more likely. Any company that needs to have their systems readily available may be prime targets right now. So it's definitely an uptick.
And just to pick up on it, one of the things I wanted to comment on the ransomware is that actually around 70 to 80% of all ransomware propagation is taking place through remote access vulnerabilities today. And of course, remote access is the means by which IT administrators and software service providers get access to computer systems to do their jobs. So there's kind of this interesting correlation between the need to open up and allow people remote access in order to do their jobs and manage the IT and IT services, and this kind of an additional wave of ransomware attacks coming in and really disrupting a lot of organizations.
So, Gail, anything to add on sort of this piece? Eve and I, of course, practice in the U.S., and so we sort of see it from this side. Obviously, Ryan is on the forensic side, based in London. But Gail, you being there in London, is all this resonating? Is this correct? Do we actually see an uptick, or are we just more sensitive to it?
No, I think
we're quite literally at home.
I think there is an uptick. I mean, they always said pre-COVID, attacks always go up in the school holidays. Not necessarily the big ransomware attacks, but bored teenagers, and we've got a lot of bored teenagers at the moment. So there's all sorts of factors that are driving it up. And I think the only other thing I would comment on is not so much the cyber attacks, but just people are not as careful at home, and they're using shared devices. I signed on today. I was Marcus Wilmot. That's my son's name. People have just become very sort of lackadaisical about the access. And I think that in itself is a risk that perhaps hasn't been such a core focus, as, we've all moved to remote working really, really quickly. And we need to start really thinking about that education and training and being very much on guard, even though we're in our home environment.
So I think, right along this side, we're getting some chats, right, around this question of, given all of what you said, Ryan, about the acceleration of home, the cloud services, Eva, more ransomware, more COVID themed, Gail, people possibly being more lax, what do we do? Are you actually safe at home from a cyber perspective? And, I was just reading a bunch of stats, report after report. Home Wi-Fi networks get this 3.5 times more likely than a corporate network to have at least one family of malware, 7.5 times more likely than a corporate network to have at least 5 families of malware. 1 in 4 home Wi-Fi routers have 1 or more services exposed to the internet. So it really is a combination of all these things that I think is the reason why we're seeing an acceleration globally, certainly in Europe as well. So let's sort of change slightly topics now and get really into the meat of this panel. So I don't know about all of you in the audience, right? But some things have thrived during COVID-19. I've never spent more time at home with the family. My youngest learned to ride a bicycle, which we thought was a miracle because he is not coordinated at all. I learned to cook, like 2 or 3 basic meals, but I'm not sure if the way we are currently interacting, including right now via this technology, is better or worse, right? And so, Gail, just a point blank question for you. Has COVID-19 work from home fundamentally changed how companies respond to incidents, for better or worse, kind of in what you've been seeing over the past 5-6 months?
I mean, I think the short answer is not really, particularly for large global organizations. This has never been, let's all get in a room. We've obviously lost that ability. But for big organizations, you were never dealing with the big breaches that way anyway. For smaller organizations, perhaps it has had more of an impact because it was sort of easier to get in the room. And I think people need to be very focused on, the sort of basics of correspondence and how you maintain privilege in this environment. And are you talking on compromised networks, and what does that mean in a work from home environment? But I don't think it's fundamentally changed. There's always, or at least, in recent years, the ability to do remote forensics. Ryan can probably talk to that in more detail than I can. Remote analysis. Of course, everything's been done remotely, so there is also a little bit of a risk of things go awry, but I don't think it's fundamentally changed. And in terms of sort of, a lot of the stuff I work on, which is the filings and the sort of regulatory fallout, that's all working remotely. I mean, that hasn't really changed either. So I think it's a no from me.
What about things like that have happened, like like Schrems 2 and data transfer issues for multinationals and stuff?
Schrems 2 is a big deal, but I don't think you can blame COVID for that, Tony.
We are blaming COVID for Schrems 2. I don't understand why is that a controversial deal? I don't understand.
I would like to blame COVID for Schrems 2. No, Schrems 2 is a big deal, right? I mean, Schrems 2, and I don't want to go down a Schrems 2 rabbit hole because I could talk for hours about this, but it's a crazy judgment that throws into uncertainty, not just transatlantic data flows, all data flows. If you read it to its sort of technical ability, it tells all companies, no matter how big, that they should do an analysis of the laws of every country they transfer data to and see whether that's essentially equivalent, which is like writing a PhD. It's ridiculous. So that in itself, I think, has had an effect. I don't think it's COVID related. It's just similar timing. And it means that we do need to just think a bit more about how we paper the things. But there's no easy answer to Schrems 2. I mean, we have to hope that the policymakers will help the organisations, because they're sort of caught here in what is effectively a political debate.
Just really quickly, Eva, your take, not on whether we blame COVID, Schrems 2 on COVID, but is it more or less business as usual, or do you actually see some differences in terms of the actual response happening, and particularly with our overseas stakeholders when this is happening?
I think from our standpoint, from the attorney standpoint, things are largely the same. From the IT standpoint, I do think that there can be some shifts and adjustments in terms of getting your hands on equipment to analyze it and just travel and moving. The pandemic has just it's the excuse for every problem that we face today. It's a pandemic. So I think that what I'm doing is largely the same. It's easier for me to hop online and jump to my desk than maybe even it was before, because I'm not going anywhere. However, I do think that the IT teams may at times find that they have to adjust to what they need to do to ship equipment around and move, and also just ensuring that a proper, dealing with the extreme uptick in the number of attacks that are occurring, and making sure that everyone has proper VPNs, proper devices, when everyone had to suddenly don't come to work tomorrow, work with what you got. And that created some issues for some companies for sure.
Great. Ryan, from the forensic side, it's easy for us, right, outside counsel, because we get to call you, Ryan, and say, hey, Ryan, got one for you, right? From a forensic perspective, has anything changed with people being home, not in the office, pandemic? Has that made your lives on the forensic side of incident response equally, if not more important than the legal compliance side? Has that changed? Has that made something different?
Yeah, so it's kind of a kind of mixed bag. In some cases, it's made life harder in the sense that we can't necessarily, get on a plane and go, put boots on the ground at a client site. In some cases, that's easier in the sense that we know the client's expectation is not there, and actually there's a lot that we can do remotely. And in fact, on the positive end, the concept of doing remote triage work is something that's become a bit more acceptable in the current situation, given that the clients themselves may not have anybody on site, let alone us going on site to support. So I think that the whole area that has been developing for a number of years is starting to become a bit more useful and acceptable. The tools that are being used for that, the clients, allowing us to deploy remote agents to carry out activity. So I think that's been a real plus. On something that's actually been a challenge on quite a few engagements, which actually affects the lawyers and us, is this kind of gray area between which IT is being used by somebody that's currently being investigated, or if an incident has happened and it's happened on a personal computer, but it's affected the business, then we've got to navigate this very murky world of EU data privacy laws. Can we get onto a person's personal machine to get access so we can do an image, so we can take data off for the company's purposes? And that again has had a mixed bag of some people being very happy to have their phones imaged and personal laptops looked into. Others have pushed back, and we've had to be have them very much involved in our acquisition process. So another interesting thing, actually, again, speaking about the cloud, is that this technology has actually helped us to do things remotely as well. We have found that we've been able to transfer files into Azure and out of AWS very quickly because we've got a cloud presence, the client's got a cloud presence. Getting an image of a server that's been hacked, there's a snapshot that gets created, they ship us the image. We can do this analysis much faster than we could ever do in a physical world where we had to go on site and copy hard disks, bring that back to the office, do the analysis, etc. So I think again, there's kind of on balance, there's this kind of mixed bag, but certainly, it hasn't stopped us doing our job, and we've continued to be extremely busy and very responsive on requirements that have come in.
We have a question from the audience that I think is really interesting, and I invite any of you to sort of jump on this. It's and it comes right on the heels of what all three of you have been saying. So if you're a company, and I'm going to tweak this question a little bit, if you're a company, can you shift liability? What are the liability risks on the employees themselves if, because of their home infrastructure or BYOD, et cetera, if that's found to be a contributing factor or significant factor in the incident taking place and or messing up the incident response? How does that sort of work? Can you kind of blame the employee? Do they shoulder some blame? Is it still with the data controller company? Does anyone want to take that? I have my own views on that, but Gail, you want to take that one real quick?
I think we all are. Yeah, I mean, no, you can't really blame the employee. It is absolutely your job as the employer, the controller of data, depending which lens you're looking at, to ensure adequate security in whatever working environment there is. But that said, as we all went to work from home within a week, I mean, everyone was moving at speed and not really thinking these things through. And I suspect in many organizations, they may have got lucky and still not have thought these things through. And I think there is an ongoing obligation to educate your employees. Your point, Tony, about the malware on a router. I mean, I know where my router is. I know how to switch it on and off again. I have no idea whether it's got malware on it. Like, what do I need to know as an individual, and what do I need to do? And that needs to be part of the corporate training, and there needs to be a whole program around that. And I think, that hasn't happened possibly quickly enough in a lot of organizations.
Yeah, I would say training and equipment, because of course you have to be trained to use the equipment you have, but also because we all went to work from home, and on a split notice, you went home one night and then the email came out that said, don't come back until ... and we're still not back. So a lot of people were perhaps using personal devices. They didn't have an opportunity to get work devices from the office. And those kind of issues can really leave holes in your network where you're dealing with someone who's using the same computer that their kid is using to play, video games on. There can be issues that pop up right there as well. So training, equipment, and really managing your policies and your practices and equipping your staff.
So Eva, the follow-up question, by the way, before we get to Ryan, the follow-up question I think you guys both anticipated was, should employees be demanding greater business support around armoring their infrastructure, devices, et cetera, during this period, right? And sort of the flip side of what you just said, which is companies should do a better job of that, right? Brian, any last thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so I certainly agree with both Gail and Eva on this. I think it is interesting. The policy side is quite interesting because has the company updated their policies because remote working has changed. And also, if an employee breaks the policy, so they do deliberately take an email, dump all of their email onto an iPad or a personal machine, and they've been told that they shouldn't do that. There could be a balance of allocating some level of responsibility to the employee. I mean, it's interesting, this question of who's responsible. I just think of the days of internet banking and security, and the banks took on the role of, some banks took on the role of providing antivirus software to their customers, and they did that because actually they felt that the burden would be on the bank if the bank got hacked, even though the customer may actually not do the right security and follow the right security practices. But because the risk implication was felt and the impact was felt by the bank, a lot of the progressive banks took that particular path. It is an open question as to how far the employers are going to go in shoring up people's personal security. I know, again, companies like Microsoft do provide additional licenses for Office 365 users for their personal use as well as for the business use. So there could be those kind of knockoff effects where employees can get access to additional tech. But ultimately, the security policy, the implementation, that is still the responsibility of the company. And the CISO needs to anticipate and build in enough security controls to know where that data is going, which devices is it allowed to travel on. If it is highly sensitive, even if an email goes onto a personal machine, it should be encrypted. It should be put in some kind of package to ensure that it cannot be accessible. Because the world we live in, people are we were on trains and airplanes and visiting airports, having coffee at Starbucks, all these wonderful things that we aren't doing today. But in that world, we had to protect the laptops, we had to protect the phones, and so it's kind of an expectation that that those controls should be there and should be managed by the company.
So I think so as I'm hearing, we can try to shift some responsibility via policy, procedure, protocol, etc. Certainly criminal activity, there will be liability risk on the individuals, but the data controller in the company, there's a fantastic chat string going on right now about cyber insurance. We can also try to shift some costs, etc. But I think, Gail, what you started with, the data controller at the end of the day will have the liability, right, with respect to and responsibility. Eva, the same thing you said, and Ryan. So thank you for that. That was a great discussion. I want to move on quickly. Goodness, we only have 10 or so minutes left. So one of my favorite attorneys I'm in Washington, D.C., is actually is an attorney at a regulator. I won't tell you who he or she is. But he or she has an awesome poster in his or her office, and it actually says it's the 7 rules of dealing with regulators, and I just love it. It's here they are. 1, let it go. 2, ignore half of what I say. 3, give it time. 4, don't compare, which means don't compare what's happening in you to other people. 5, stay calm. 6, it's on you to have a good attitude. And 7, smile. So those are the 7 rules of dealing with regulators. Now, Eva, you have lots of international global clients. A lot of them are having a lot of bad things happen to them. That's the whole purpose for this panel and forum. How are regulators treating incident response differently or not due to COVID / work from home? Give us a sense for that.
In my experience, there really hasn't been much change at all. Under GDPR, the timing is the timing, and you have that 72-hour rule. You need to respond. I haven't seen much anyone being more lenient or more strict. We've had filings, for example, with the ICO and done follow-ups, and they weren't more aggressive than they were in pre-COVID times. So thus far, my experience with ICO and also other regulators in other regions of the world have not been more aggressive. If anything, And I believe that COVID is humanizing a lot of people. So, all of those 7 pointers seem to be where their hearts are. Everyone kind of gets it a little more, I hope. But they've been pretty reasonable thus far.
So semi business as usual. But Gail, you like the last time when we talked, you said that there was like an ICO press release about how they might. And by the way, let's all be careful because we may have representatives on this audience in the forum from regulators.
I said I like you.
I thought you said I thought you said there might be a press release about that the ICO, for lack of a better term, maybe taking it easier a little bit more. Because they understand kind of the predicament. Is that?
I forget whether it was a press release or a statement on their site. It was when COVID first hit, and I think it was in the context of, as we all moved very quickly to this strange world. Obviously, for a few weeks there's a layer of disruption, and it was sort of, if that is you're not going to hit your data subject access requests, or in this context, I guess, your breach notification requirements, then they would take that into consideration. I haven't had an example that I can point to that say that they did or they didn't. They are normally very reasonable as a regulator anyway, in terms of extenuating circumstances. I do think we've now got to a point, though, that it's quite hard to say 6 months in, we're still really struggling, because, you've sort of had 6 months. So I think it is very much business as usual. And, they've obviously got a lot on their plates, because in addition to their normal workflow, there are lots of complex questions about how you use data in the concept of COVID to protect, to share incidents of COVID, to create these tracking apps. And that is a whole, another and complex and very important work stream for the regulators.
What about private litigation? Has there been an uptick since COVID started in terms of people, just quick to trigger? And again, in the European sort of marketplace, Gail, has that been something since we're on that sort of topic of enforcement?
So again, this is a bit like your Schrems question. I think there are two elements. It's not purely coincidental here. We are moving to a world with GDPR of seeing more class action type litigation around data breaches and other breaches of data privacy law. And we're going to continue on the train. Like, that train is going to keep accelerating. And we've seen it in the UK. The Morrison's case was sort of, almost a gating case. And we're beginning to see it following some of the significant breaches, because there are organizations now who will sort of try and pull those claims together. The bit that isn't, because that I think is just coincidental timing, is there are a lot of people with time on their hands, a lot of people who are, unfortunately, aren't working. And I suspect that some of them will look at this sort of stuff, and you might see a bit of an uptick due to that. People thinking, well, I don't have a job anymore, how can I make some money? So I'm not sure it's a sort of, totally being driven by COVID, but I think that might be a factor.
So, Ryan, sort of linked to the concept of enforcement, I think we actually have someone from law enforcement, by the way, on one of the spotlight panels coming up here. Your shop interacts with law enforcement a lot. Any impact on that end of things with respect to COVID? Are these paying more attention? Are they more responsive? Are they doing things differently? Anything there to share?
I think, they're probably in a very similar situation to a lot of other organizations about being stretched and sometimes being limited by being able to provide physical visits to clients. But we've seen, and this is over a number of years, not just over COVID, there's been a huge effort to coordinate the law enforcement in the UK. We've got something called the NCSC, which is formed to help respond to cyber incidents and inform industry and companies and share information. And I think what's happened with COVID is because we don't all have the luxury of having everybody involved, all the time. There's a huge amount of kind of very strong collaboration to work together, to share information, to share insights, and it's also been felt in terms of industry impacts. So, if one organization, and we're working with one quite recently that has been impacted by ransomware, that particular attack is also impacting on others. and being able to share that information and broadcast that out really makes the whole much stronger than the individuals in a sense. So that collaboration is certainly something which I've seen a great increase in, and look forward to more in the future as well.
Excellent. Guys, we are unbelievably at nearly at time. Let me do this. Let me just go around, starting with Eva first, and then Gail, Ryan. You've shared a ton of expertise and sort of insight for the trenches. If you just had sort of one or two bits of advice as practitioners for companies, for clients to keep in mind, again, around incident response during COVID / work from home, or more precisely, EU incident response during COVID and work from home, what would you say? Maybe start with Eva, and then we'll go around.
I'll be quick. Have a plan, practice it, be prepared for when these types of things occur, and invest in your backup in IT. Yeah.
Excellent. Gail?
I think I would say focus on the piece we were talking about in the middle of the session, i.e., look at your policies and your training programs and think of working from home as the new normal. What needs to change, and how do you improve the security environment and the knowledge of your employee workforce to try and mitigate against the risk?
Excellent. Ryan?
So for me, it's really understanding your cloud exposure and this kind of digital exposure that you now have. Make sure that you lock it all down, and don't forget those remote access connections, which still seem to be a problem. So, use two-factor authentication, put in place proper encryption, and just get a better hold of these access points.
So we have some questions from the audience, and it's almost like you guys predict what's going to happen because I'm the only one that can see the questions. But Ryan and Gail and Eva, just cluing off what you just said, there's a question that I think is really good. We've been talking a lot about this sort of company and the different uses, the mobile devices, et cetera, and we've touched on cloud, which is of course a third-party service. How does the panel have a view on managing risk regarding those third-party service providers and IR techniques, challenges, for example, where forensics and the breach, et cetera, are happening at a third party during sort of this time, right? Is there a heightened sort of risk? Are there complications when it's now not just our 4 or 5 walls, whatever you want to call it, but a third party? Any views on that? And maybe Ryan just.
So I think, the word cloud comes to mind again, and it's clouded in terms of who has responsibility for security, who has responsibility to deal with the breaches and so on. And then it kind of links back into Eva's comments around planning, because these are the things we should be asking before a breach happens. So speak to your third party, work through the process. If my server gets hacked, will I be able to access the data? Will you be able to give me the logs? I was working on a case quite recently, which was cloud-based, and the client, unfortunately, the service provider turned around and said, "We're really sorry. We do have a massive a number of other attacks going on with other clients. We can't give you the information right now." It's kind of one of the things that does happen in these shared environments. So make sure you do understand the responsibility and do the planning. A lot of people think they've outsourced the problem to the third party, but they haven't. Often the third party doesn't take full responsibility. So have those things clarified as well.
Yeah. And due diligence, I would say, I know we're talking about the back end once it's happened with a third party, but a big part of how you save some stress is doing your due diligence on the front end. So having proper terms in your agreements with these service providers, checking out their security controls and making sure that they have the controls in place that you would want to protect your data so that you're passing through all of your privacy and security requirements. I think the front end can save you a lot of stress on the back end.
Yeah, and I just add to that. We all see clauses saying that you'll notify your customers if there's a breach, but actually they're few and far between that have fairly detailed provisions about the level of interaction and information you would get and who you would get access to. And it means if you are one of the customers with those clauses, you'll sort of get prioritized because there's a risk of contractual breach if they're not getting that information to you. So I think that's something that's hugely helpful.
Gail, we have a couple more minutes. Gail, a question specifically for you. Are regulators relaxing their monitoring of data breaches during COVID? And if they are to some extent, is it likely that post-COVID, they're going to get more aggressive in their investigations and start looking at some of the stuff we've been talking about now, asking about, did you have a work from home policy? Did you actually have remote? Did you settle on all the things that Ryan has been talking about from a technical perspective, and you guys have been talking about from a compliance and sort of management perspective? What's your sort of current take and then prediction, Gail?
I don't believe they're relaxing the way they look at it. There may, within some of the regulators, just be capacity and bandwidth issues, given some of the other things they need to deal with. But I think we're seeing that across the board. It's taking a long time for investigations and decisions to come out of all of the regulators, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for businesses. But, there clearly are capacity constraints there. I think what we will see, though, is less sympathy to issues that were caused by COVID, in that that there is a sort of level of sympathy of, well, this might have happened because of remote access as we all moved. I think as you have been in this environment for 6 months, 12 months, they will expect you to have fixed all of those things. And I think it follows the trend of the sort of theme of, I think, what we're all saying, which is, this is the new normal, at least for a period of time. So you can't sort of bury your head and say, don't worry, we'll be back in the office soon. You really have to fix your train of thought to, this is the work environment. It needs to be as secure as the office. And we need to make sure that from a technical, from a policy, from a training perspective, that's how we're looking at it.
That's fantastic. There's one more question that I think is could be a topic in and of itself. I'm going to put it out there because we still have about 90 seconds or so, 120 seconds. Here it is. The pace of innovation and technological innovation is totally outstripping regulation, right? And I think we've all been touching on aspects of that. What do we make of that? How do companies then think about, in the context of cyber, IR, the fact that the regulation is a little behind and our companies and clients are just doing crazy, crazy things with different bits and bytes and software and development and different data use cases and things like that? Does anyone want to just quickly, I have a couple thoughts on that, but does anybody want to just take that on? What should companies be thinking about, given they're doing, again, engaging really cool service providers, engaging technology that is unbelievable, and raising their risk profile, and all the while the regulators are behind. Any thoughts, guys, on that?
I've got a bit of a story about this. So many years ago, we were involved in a big cyber breach, and to remediate, we needed to roll out monitoring technology, stuff that actually today would be fairly acceptable, but it took years because we had to get it through. It was a global organization, through works councils in continental Europe. There were elements of the way this worked in that it sort of scanned content that potentially hit the interception rules that are criminal. And we still see that. And I think, the way we looked at it was we actually had to get expert opinion to say, this is the only way, and this is now the best practice. And the laws haven't kept up, but we felt that would give us a defendable position if we were called into question by a regulator. And I think we're going to continue to see this, right? We have an obligation, and fortunately that has been strengthened, at least if you look at the GDPR, you've got very clear obligations around security. But you have other things that would stop you effectively using the best way to protect the security. So I do think you have to take a level of risk, but you have to do it sensibly with your eyes open and in a very sort of documented way to sort of prove that you weren't cavalier about it. You looked, there was no other option. This was the option. This is what all of the experts said you needed to protect the data, and make sure you sort of go through those steps. It's not easy though. Great insight.
So I think unfortunately that's it for time. Let me leave everybody with this. First of all, thank you on behalf of the panel and on behalf of myself, right? Thank you so much. You remember earlier when I told you about the 7 rules of dealing with regulators. Let it go, ignore, give it time, don't compare, stay calm, it's on you, and smile. My friend told me that that is actually based on a really famous poster about the 7 rules of life. And so we hope that in this time of COVID and work from home, that you all incorporate those into your daily lives. And again, we thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you,
Bruce,
Tony.
over to you.
No better moderator than Tony Kim, ever. Great job. Eva, Gail, Ryan, thank you so much for a terrific panel. So our next panel is our next spotlight. It's on fighting cybercrime in the UK, and it'll feature Andrew Gould from the National Police Chiefs Council. And that will start at 3:35 BST. So I hope you all will join us again in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.